Man needs no slides.
I get called the China bear so often, and it really bothers me because I'm not a bear, I'm a skeptic. And one of the things that I want to argue in the presentation today is let's assume that a lot of the stuff that Jim says is wrong. Let's assume that there aren't significant problems with the reform process. Let's assume that there isn't going to be discontent at the popular level. Let's make all of these heroic assumptions. And let's assume that Beijing manages the transition well. And I think, since this is a public meeting, I'm not going to tell you what I really think, but it's something that sometimes we're a little bit uncomfortable talking about. But what I want to do is talk about what are the consequences of a well-managed transition and a well-managed rebalancing of the Chinese economy, because I think it has some really important implications from an investment point of view. And if I'm wrong, if it turns out to be much more chaotic than I think it is, well, then that just means that it's even more so. The implications are likely to occur even more quickly. Before doing so, I wanted to address a couple of things that Jim mentioned. The first thing is, he makes a big deal about debt, and I think that's the key issue in China. In 2005, when I first started writing about this rebalancing process in China, one of the most astonishing things that I said, which really got people really very, very surprised, was to me not astonishing at all. It was sort of obvious. And that is what's happening in China is not unprecedented. We've seen these investment-driven growth models before. We've seen investment-driven growth miracles many times before. And they all end up exactly the same way. They start out reasonably well. Investment levels are quite high, but there are a lot of opportunities for economically viable projects. But at some point, given the distortions in the pricing system and given the desperate need to keep investment levels high, you move into a position in which you continue with high levels of investment, but they're no longer economically viable. And when that happens, debt must rise more quickly than debt servicing capacity. That, of course, is unsustainable. And that's why we always run into a debt problem. The amount of debt there is in China, we don't really know how much there is, but it's really significant. If someone tells you that Chinese government debt is less than 80% of GDP, he's wrong. I don't know what the number is, but it's not less than 80% of GDP. It's substantially more. It depends on how you include all of the fiscal expenditures that take place through the banking side. So that's the key thing that we've really been watching, our debt levels, and the growth in debt has been really extraordinary. The other thing that Jim mentions, he talks about urbanization. And this, to me, has been one of the most frustrating debates of the last couple of years. Because urbanization is highly pro-cyclical. We know that. We've seen that in many countries, including the United States. But understand what pro-cyclicality means. It means that when things are going well, the urbanization process will cause even more rapid growth. Because as people move to the cities and get all of these jobs, whether they're productive or not, there is additional expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. But the pro-cyclicality of urbanization means that you can only count on urbanization when things are going well. If the economy starts to slow down, urbanization itself becomes a problem, either because people stop moving to the cities, so all of our projections of growth turn out to be too high, or they do move to the cities, but they don't have productive jobs, in which case social costs turn out to be much higher than we expected. Perhaps there's an increase in crime, whatever. But urbanization, which is now sort of the default bull argument in China, we have to be really careful about that because that has never been a bull argument. It's only a bull argument when things are going really well. The other thing Jim mentioned, don't look at Beijing and Shanghai for your idea of what's happening in China. The IMF just came out with a new report, and what their argument is that the real problem with investment, and this is something that we've been saying for a long time, is not on the East Coast. The real problem with investment is in the interior of the economy. The whole Go West argument, which is based on the success of the Go West argument in the United States, is based on a misconception because there are many countries that have gone west or done the equivalent. The Soviet Union went east in the 50s and 60s. Brazil went into the Amazonas in the northeast in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And those were later agreed to have been a huge waste of money. And the problem there, I think, is that in the US, when we went west, it was the private sector that led the process, and the government simply followed and created the infrastructure that was already needed. In China, it much more resembles the Soviet Union or Brazil in the sense that nobody wants to go west in China. The only reason they're going west is because the government is building infrastructure, right? And as soon as they stop building the infrastructure, everybody moves back. So the whole Go West program is a complete waste. Meanwhile, Beijing and Shanghai, you can think of as these huge vacuum cleaners that are sucking in resources from the rest of the country. So of course, Beijing and Shanghai are quite profitable, but their profitability tells us nothing about the overall profitability of the economy, because all of that wasted investment is ultimately is channeled through Shanghai or Beijing, and of course, as big financial centers, they're extremely profitable, but they are not representative of China. If you want to see China, go west. I spent 4 years in Haiti, and I can tell you, parts of China are like Haiti. And they're building infrastructure there that if they were to do so in Haiti, well, none of you are long Haiti, I'm sure, but if you were, you would immediately short the country. That's the level of poverty and the level of the very low level of productivity that we see in the western parts of China, in which massive investments are being made. Finally, there's two other things that I want to mention. Jim mentioned environmental costs. A Chinese academic in 2010 calculated that the cost of environmental degradation was 3.5% of GDP, right? And he suggested that that was probably a low number. So because we're not correctly costing GDP, forget about everything else that he said about wasted investment. That alone suggests that GDP is being overstated by as much as 3.5 percentage points. So you do that over several years, and you come to the conclusion that China's real GDP is much lower than the numbers that the proposed numbers. I think China's GDP may be overstated by something like 30%, maybe even more, if you include environmental degradation. But just the environmental cost is really significant. And then the last thing I want to bring up from what he spoke about real estate. And there have been many measures to try to slow real estate growth in China. For example, they've put new taxes on real estate ownership. There's a capital gains tax if you sell your apartments, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think they're going to work. And the reason I don't think they're going to work is because I don't think they address the underlying problem. There was a really interesting statistic that I saw last week. In 2006, if you looked at the 15 most expensive cities in the world, only one of them was in the developing world. It was Moscow. Today, 8 of the most expensive cities in the world are in developing countries. And that suggests to me that's what's really been driving real estate prices has been possibly QE in the United States, which is just another way of saying it's liquidity. It's liquidity that's driving very high real estate prices. And unless you address the liquidity problem, you cannot address the real estate bubble. So all of this talk about putting taxes and making it more difficult for people to buy apartments, it doesn't really matter. The underlying problem is liquidity. So let me talk a little bit about what a rebalancing in China will look like. Now, we saw rebalancing. There actually has been a little bit of rebalancing that has taken place, and it took place in the first half of last year. What do I mean by that? Well, we all know what rebalancing in China means. The country is overly reliant on investment for growth. Investment is being misallocated. There's no more debate about that. We all know investment is being misallocated. But the problem is, the moment you bring investment growth down, GDP growth collapses. So what you need to do is you need to replace it with consumption. If we can bring investment growth down but bring consumption up, then we can continue with high growth rates in China. But how do you bring consumption up? China has, as you know, the highest savings rate, not just in the world, but probably ever recorded. And there's a lot of talk about why the Chinese save so much, and a lot of it is wrong. So, for example, you will hear that China is a Confucian society, and as we all know, Confucians save a lot of money. They work very hard and they save a lot of money. Well, that's not true. Until the 1960s and 1970s, when we were trying to explain why East Asia seemed so permanently mired in poverty, the answer was, one of the explanations was, Well, that's how Confucian systems, how Confucian societies operate. They don't work very hard and they don't save money, right? This is true. And there's 2,000 years of criticism of Confucian society that says exactly that. That's why it was so easy for us to say in the 50s and 60s, the problem with Asia is Confucianism. And now, of course, Confucianism is what's solving all the Asian problems. That can't possibly be true. Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, in my book, I cite him in 1974. He put taxes to force up the savings rate in Singapore. And you know what his reasoning was? He said this very explicitly. He said the problem with Singapore is there are too many Chinese people, and Chinese don't save, right? So he had to force up the savings rate. So what really explains the high savings rate in China? Well, it has nothing to do with household savings. It almost never has anything to do with household savings. For example, the German savings rate soared after 2000. Did the Germans become more thrifty? No, they didn't at all. The German savings rate went up for exactly the same reason that the Chinese savings rate went up, although it was not as extreme. And that is because the household share of GDP declined dramatically. So in China, the household share of GDP is the lowest maybe ever recorded. Household income is roughly 50% of GDP. Under those circumstances, it's not surprising that household consumption is so low, right? If the income share of GDP is very low, then by definition, the consumption share of GDP must be very low. To say it another way, assume we could bring the household savings rate in China to 0, which would be even worse than in the US. In that case, China would still be the lowest consuming country in the world. So the problem is not the propensity to save of households. The problem is that household income is too low. And if household income is too low, household consumption is too low. And as you know, savings is simply GDP minus consumption. That's why the Chinese savings rate is so high. So if you want to raise consumption, that is lower savings, there's really only one way to do it, and that's to increase the household income share of GDP. So Beijing knows this. Everyone says now that what we need to do is to increase the household income share of GDP. So I'm going to assume that it's possible to do that. It's possible to do that in a non-disruptive way. So how do you go about doing it? Well, there are only a few ways you can raise the household income share of GDP. One way is do nothing and let debt levels continue to rise until we reach debt capacity limits, and then China will rebalance. It'll rebalance in a chaotic way, but it will rebalance. After all, the United States in the early 1930s, it rebalanced. But how did it rebalance? Investment declined by 90%. GDP declined by 35%. Household consumption declined by 10%. So the US rebalanced. So if China does nothing, it will rebalance, but it will rebalance in a very chaotic way. So what can China do not to rebalance in a chaotic way? Well, it can take steps to increase the household share of GDP, the household income share of GDP. How can it do it? Well, one way is to reverse the mechanisms that caused household income to decline so rapidly. And these mechanisms are very straightforward. For a while, there was a big debate about there, but I don't think there's a debate anymore. I think everybody now understands. China is just the Japanese growth model on steroids. And there were three very important mechanisms that both caused rapid growth and rapid growth in the imbalances. And they are basically an undervalued currency, low wage growth relative to productivity growth, and most importantly, and most difficult to explain, is financial repression. Let me briefly explain the three of them, because I think it's really important to understand that. First off, how does an undervalued currency work? Well, most economists know. There's nothing very controversial about this. When your currency is systematically undervalued, it's as if you had put a consumption tax on imports. So it's basically a consumption tax. And it reduces the real value of disposable household income, because you increase the price of imports. The proceeds of that tax go to subsidize, obviously, the tradable goods sector. But so notice what it does. By subsidizing the tradable goods sector, it's pushing up GDP growth faster than it otherwise would have been. But the cost of the subsidies are borne by the household sector. So it's pushing down the growth rate of household income. So undervalued currencies have a tendency to create more rapid growth but slower growth in household income, so they force up the savings rate. That's pretty well understood. I don't think there's a lot of debate about that. The second issue is quite important too, and that is the difference between wage growth and productivity growth. In an equilibrium, wages and productivity grow at roughly the same pace, and so workers keep a constant share of what they produce. In developing countries, you typically see productivity growth grow faster than wages, probably because you have a lot of underemployed or unemployed people in the rural sector, and as they move to the cities, they depress wages. And that's what happened in China in the 1980s and 1990s. In the last decade, though, the split between the two exploded. Productivity tripled, wages only doubled. I'm not really sure why, but it doesn't matter why. What matters is that it has the same impact on the savings rate. Why? Because you can think of the gap between wages and productivity growth as a kind of tax on workers' income, and it's a growing tax. So it puts downward pressure on the growth of household income, this tax. But the tax subsidizes employers, all kinds of employers who create GDP. So notice what it does. Again, it subsidizes GDP growth, so it pushes it up. But it does so at the expense of household income, so it pushes it down. That's, again, pretty well understood, I think. The only difference between an undervalued currency and low wage growth is the way it distributes the benefits and the costs. So an undervalued currency, the main cost goes to households as importers, which basically means the urban middle class, because they tend to have the highest component of imports in their income. The beneficiaries are the tradable goods sector. The second tax, the wage productivity differential tax, hurts households as workers, and it benefits all employers generally, and it particularly benefits the labor-intensive sector, which in China are the small and medium enterprises. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because I think that's a very important issue. The third tax is the financial repression tax, and that's the most important. In China, interest rates are too low, way too low, at least 500 to 800 basis points too low. If you believe CPI, which none of us do, the real interest rate, the real lending rate in China is roughly equivalent to the real lending rate in the United States for much of the past 10 to 20 years, which doesn't make sense, right? A very rapidly growing, capital-poor, very volatile economy should have a much higher real cost of capital than a country like the United States. If you believe CPI, they're roughly the same, but none of us believe CPI. If you look at the GDP deflator, which may be a much better measure of true inflation in China, then the real lending rate may have been negative by 200 to 300 basis points almost every year in the past decade. I think there is no economic theory that says that that's appropriate. So why does that matter? Well, if interest rates are set artificially low, that's also a tax. It's a tax on savings. And the beneficiaries of the tax are borrowers. They have their borrowing costs significantly subsidized. So who are net savers? Well, surprise, surprise, it's the household sector. Who are net borrowers? Not households. There's state-owned enterprises, large manufacturers, local and provincial governments, the central bank, the PBOC, which, by the way, has probably been bankrupt for many years, insolvent, I should say, real estate developers, et cetera. So you have this massive subsidy paid for by the household sector, which subsidizes tremendous growth, because if you lower the cost of capital, of course you will get more investment and more GDP growth, at least nominal GDP growth, but at the expense of the household sector. So notice that it does the same thing. It transfers wealth from the household sector, but to the extent they save, which means the very poor are not affected and the very rich are not affected. It's the urban middle class, once again, that pays for this. And it subsidizes anybody who's a borrower, which tend to be government or government-related entities. Small and medium enterprises don't get access to this cheap funding. So if this is the reason both for rapid growth in China and for the huge imbalance in China, then one of the ways you resolve the imbalance in China is reverse these mechanisms. But here's the problem. If you reverse them quickly, if you raise the value of the currency 20 or 30%, if you raise interest rates 300, 400 basis points, if you raise wages sharply, and in 2010, 2011, wages went up quite sharply. If you do that, you spread financial distress throughout the economy. In fact, the small and medium enterprises in 2010, 2011 had enormous distress, and we saw massive bankruptcies. Since everyone knows that SMEs, small and medium enterprises, are the only efficient part of the Chinese economy, they've stopped doing that. But I would propose to you that one of the reasons wages went up and the real cost of capital went down during that period, so China didn't rebalance, may have to do with the politics of rebalancing. If you raise interest rates, who suffers? State-owned enterprises, local and provincial governments. Are they powerful? Yes, they're extremely powerful. If you raise the currency, who gets hurt? Guangdong province, Zhejiang province, tradable goods sector, are they powerful? Yes, they're extremely powerful. If you raise wages, who gets hurt? The labor-intensive sector, small and medium enterprises and service industries. Are they powerful? No, they're not powerful at all. And I would suggest that that's the only reason we saw rebalancing in the form of wages and nowhere else, for political reasons. But let's assume we can ignore all of the politics of it, and we raise all of these things very quickly. Well, China will rebalance, but again, it'll rebalance the way the US rebalanced in the early 1930s. It will rebalance because everything will fall, but consumption will fall more slowly than everything else. GDP growth could go negative. So you can't really do that. So why not do all of those things, but really slowly over the next 10 years? Give companies a chance to adjust. Well, the problem there is that the distortions are so deep that if you eliminate the distortions slowly, you're not making the imbalances better. You're simply making them worse at a slower pace. So we run into the timing problem. I believe that we can't continue this process for much more than 3 or 4 years without running into debt capacity constraints. So doing it slowly, which is the default notion of Beijing, I don't think will work. And I think there's a lot of desperation about the ability to do it slowly. So what else can you do? Well, if you want to increase the household share of total income or of total wealth, well, it's easy to do that conceptually. For 30 years, the Chinese pie has been growing very quickly, but the household share of the pie has been contracting. The net result was that household income continued to grow quite quickly, 7 or 8%, while GDP was growing at 11 or 12%. But that means that somebody else, their share of this rapidly growing pie was growing. And who's somebody else? Well, it's basically the state sector. It's a proxy for the state sector, which means the elite families and groups that control the state sector. So you saw very rapid growth in their wealth. Well, why not transfer it back? Why not simply transfer resources from the state sector to the household sector? You can do that. You can grant peasants the title to their land. You can eliminate the residency requirements. You can privatize and use the money to clean up the debt and then raise interest rates. They're starting to talk about that. But as you can imagine, there's tremendous political resistance to it. The cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou don't want to eliminate the residency requirements because their costs will soar. Local and municipal governments don't want to give away land because that's their biggest source of revenue. And of course, the groups and families that control the state sector don't want to see privatization there. Now, the Russians solved that problem, remember. When they wanted to privatize, there was tremendous resistance from the groups that control the state sector. So how do they privatize? Well, basically, they bribe them. Company's worth 10 billion, I'll sell it to you for 5. I think that's going to happen. There's tremendous resistance to privatization, but once we see how profitable it can be for certain groups, I suspect that the resistance disappears. It's a very inefficient privatization, but it is a privatization, and if the money is genuinely used to transfer to the household sector, then it will create a rebalancing. But it's going to take many years to do that. There's one other thing they can do, and logically I can't think of anything else. The one other thing they can do is, I can make you wealthier by giving you my assets, but I can also make you wealthier by taking your debt. And in my interpretation, that's what happened in Japan, because remember, after 1990, Japan genuinely rebalanced. But how did it rebalance? Government debt was 20% of GDP in 1990. Today it's, I don't know what it is, 200 and something percent. My interpretation is that basically private sector debt was shifted off of the private sector balance sheets onto the government balance sheet as a form of rebalancing, as a sort of a form of privatization. And this is already starting to happen in China. My suspicion is that this is what's going to happen. We're going to see debt transferred onto the government balance sheet. We're going to start seeing some privatization and other tinkering at the edges. The currency will go up. The aggregate of the currency, wages, and interest rates will go up. So that's a good rebalancing. Am I running too late? Is that?
I'm told I'm supposed to.
Okay. Okay. I will do it. I will come to the conclusion. I will come to the conclusion very, very quickly. First off, rebalancing means, by definition, an erosion of China's export competitiveness. China is competitive not because of any natural reasons. It's competitive because borrowers get free capital or negative capital, wage growth has been restrained, and the currency is undervalued. Rebalancing means those things in the aggregate have to go up. I don't know which one will go up, but in the aggregate they'll have to go up. That means China's export competitiveness is going to be eroded. This is great news for countries like Mexico. This is great news for countries whose manufacturing sectors have been decimated by the Chinese export juggernaut in the last 10 years. Secondly, rebalancing means that investment growth rates are either going to slow or go negative. Jim's already given you all the numbers about the impact on hard commodity prices. I would be really shocked if hard commodity prices didn't drop by at least 50% over the next 2 to 3 years. They must. If China doesn't bring investment rates down quickly enough, they're going to run into debt capacity constraints. So it's got to happen. And then the final thing I'll tell you from an investment point of view, again, Jim's already mentioned that he's like a kid in a candy store when it comes to shorting. But if you look at the aggregate profitability of the SOE sector, there's two big problems. One problem is that cash flow doesn't match earnings. A lot of the growth in profitability in the SOE sector is coming through growth in receivables, which is usually a bad sign. But more importantly, there have been a number of studies done on the mainland and in Hong Kong about the subsidies to the SOE sector. And when you add them all up, they are anywhere from 5 to 10 times the aggregate profitability of the SOE sector. The value of the subsidies are 5 to 10 times their profitability, which means that if you eliminate the subsidies, SOEs are huge value destroyers. In fact, even if you don't eliminate the subsidies, they are huge value destroyers, but they only get to show a profit because of this massive transfer. Rebalancing means you've got to bring that transfer down. And I don't see any way China can rebalance without the profitability of the SOE sector collapsing, and that includes the banking system. So I would say over the medium to long term, it's hard to imagine profits in the SOE sector staying very, very high. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop there, and then maybe we can open it up to questions.
That was amazing. You have a future as a diplomat. That was the most optimistically dire talk I've ever heard in my entire life.
I live in China.
I'm gonna take it. You answered some of the questions I had. Is what would you do? And you hit that really, I thought, well at the end of the presentation. And there are some tough choices, but they do have some things they can do. They just won't be pleasant to outsiders.
Very difficult.
So I'll open it right away to just question. I have really bad eyesight, so put your hand up high if you've got a question. Yep. In the back? No? Okay. Right here. Over here.
I'd like to hear y'all debate about whether China's currency is undervalued or overvalued based on your sort of anecdotal evidence, Jim.
The question is China's currency undervalued, as I think you said, but or overvalued? What do you think, Michael?
Well, I think the currency is undervalued, but I think that's the wrong metric. I think there's no such thing as an equilibrium price for the currency. It depends on a lot of other things. If China were to do one single thing, I would argue that it should raise its interest rate significantly. And if it raises its interest rate significantly, then the relative undervaluation of the tradable goods sector in China would disappear. But the key point is that in the aggregate, all three of those things have to go up. Which one goes up more than the other is a political question, not an economic question. But in the aggregate, those three things explain China's export competitiveness. So it depends.
Before I forget, can I put a plug in for your book?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
No.
I'm halfway through it. It's great.
Thanks.
Tell the audience the name of the book.
It's called The Great Rebalancing.
Yeah,
It's about the rebalancing process globally. In June, my book will come out on the Chinese economy, which for those of you interested in China should be a lot more interesting.
Okay, other question right here.
If the technological advances that are coming along, micro production, like locally sort of setting, how much would that affect China? Because right now China's kind of like the manufacturer for the world, but because of energy costs or technology, cheaper robotics, some of that stuff is starting to be built closer to consumption points. How much would that affect, like, how much could China be ignited based on its own internal consumption and consume goods internally, or how much are they structured towards just being an export machine?
New technologies and trends in manufacturing, positive or negative for China?
Yeah.
I'm not smart enough to answer that. I'll let Jim answer that. But I will say the problem in consumption is an income problem. So it doesn't really matter how you increase or what they consume. What really matters is how you increase the household income share of GDP.
I'll just give you one quick anecdote on that, and I'm not an economist, so I'm going to punt on the question, but increasingly now there are robotics going into Chinese manufacturing facilities where really the advantage was cheap labor, interchangeable labor, and those are exactly now this latest level of robotics is replacing. And so one could argue that from a non-service economy, which we are, a manufacturing-driven economy might be impacted rather dramatically by a shift in technology. But John Maudlin and Michael are better equipped than me to answer that.
Michael, I don't mean to put you on the spot, so seriously, if you'd rather go ahead. But how serious do you think the risk is that there could really be a violent outcome to this? I mean, when you look at the United States in the 1930s, right? You know, it was a pretty socially cohesive society. We came through a really rough patch. I would say the same thing for Japan. Europe in the 1930s, not so much, right? China doesn't seem like a really strongly cohesive society, such that if it really goes through this in the wrong way, it could be pretty nasty.
All right, a possible downside to social cohesion. As your attorney, I would advise you not to answer this question.
I will take your advice.
Okay. I think it's a very interesting question. I alluded to other issues. I obviously, I guess I can speak a little bit more freely, but it is social cohesion is an issue in China. And I think that this compact, the social compact that the party has, because let's face it, this is not a party running on ideology anymore. It really isn't. When the leaders are all billionaires, we must say that the Marxist-Leninist ideology is, maybe been watered down a little bit. So, and sometimes with pigs in it. So it's, but I think that as long as nominal growth was there, truly raising standards of living, and it has been remarkable. Let's face it, compared to 1979, I mean, the Chinese economy went nowhere for 30 years. I think it's really fair to say.
They were richer than South Korea in the 1950s.
Yeah, and yet it is expectations, and it is expectations of the intelligentsia and the bourgeoisie, to use these old terms, that if in fact growth begins to shift or shift violently or really transform or wipe out generational savings in the real estate market, by the way, which is another sort of gray swan out there in China. Yes, you have the coal magnates borrowing money at the corporate level and buying 10 apartments in Shanghai, but you also do have a number of people that are borrowing from their grandparents and their parents to get that first condo in a tier 2 or tier 3 city, and they may see real wealth erosion of generational savings, which would also be another ingredient to the witch's brew. So it's a good question, a really good question.
I had the impression that over the last couple of decades, the best and the brightest minds went into government in China. And what are the ramifications? If it's that screwed up with the brightest going there, is that trend changing? Was that trend ever true?
It's just like France. the brightest go into government? They do, I think.
I've taught at the 2 top universities in China, and the best and the brightest come to the US, actually. I'm not kidding. The best and the brightest do come to the US, which is really good for us. But, you know, maybe Jim's joking about France. I'm half French, so I get a little bit, you know, uncomfortable with that. But let's be honest. I don't think there is any historical evidence that countries with the smartest leaders outperform. I think the historical evidence suggests that countries that have robust mechanisms for correcting mistakes, that have robust mechanisms for identifying different policies, tend to do quite well. But we have plenty of cases of countries with very, very smart leaders that were driven into the ground. So I would say it doesn't really matter what kind of people go into government. What really matters is what kind of government you have, how it deals with the types of choices it makes, and how it deals with self-correcting mechanisms. I think that's really the key point of democracy.
I just point out that I'm half Greek and half Irish, and if you're listening to me, you've really got a problem. So, based on ethnicity. All right, I'm told last question. Back? The back, all the way.
Jim, you were talking about the infrastructure building in China, and you know, I've heard the argument, Michael, that what they're doing is they're building all that now because in 10 years with the aging population, they will not have the funds to do that because it will be in the elder care. So what if, you know, that's actually smart, longer range planning, you know, they're buying commodities in Africa. Maybe is there a case to be made that just as we've been amazed about what they've been able to do in 10 years, you know, looking forward, you know, we may look back and say, wow, you were talking about the Chinese coming over here. I was actually in the impression that as opposed to staying here, they have started to go back. So now we have Western, you know, MBAs educated, not only students, but also business people that actually have gone back home because of all the money that, okay, you know, in a corrupt way perhaps, but has been able to be made. So could you make a case that the infrastructure is being built now because of, you know, pressing reasons?
Okay, first of all, before he answers, and I'm going to word politically about his answer a little bit, but first of all, have you seen the construction in China? Most of it's not going to be there in 10 years. I mean, quite literally.
That's not a joke.
And it is substandard. I recall that when one of the rail bridges collapsed a couple years ago, the authorities found out that instead of the rebar and everything else, it was stuffed with rags and all kinds of things that were not exactly up to code, shall we say. So it's a real issue, and it's why capital depreciation is an important determinant in our work, number one. And I think that's important. I actually educate Chinese students at Yale, graduate students. About 20% of my course, second-year students, are the sons and daughters of the elite. And I would be willing to bet, although the family would stay there, if our visa program changed for graduate students, you're getting automatic, particularly if they have certain advanced degrees, I would bet at least half of them would stay in the US and start businesses or work here. So
Well, actually, Jim, according to the U.S. Embassy, 2/3 of them stay in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that number hasn't really changed that
So
much.
actually they do stay,
They
get
stay in the
exemptions.
U.S., yeah.
Yeah.
And the only difference, the only thing that's really changed in the last couple of years is the number that are leaving has gone up pretty significantly. For good reasons or bad reasons, I can't tell you. But that's, on the other hand, China's got 1.3 billion people, so they've got plenty of smart people left. But I would add one other thing, because we often hear this thing about why not build for the old. There's certainly need for social housing. There's certainly need for massive investment in education, you know, kindergarten out in the countryside. And the problem with all of that, I don't want to sound very cold-hearted, but the problem with all of that is that may be socially useful and it may be politically useful, but it's not economically useful. And what we need in China are investments that over the next 5 to 6 years, they create more rapid growth in debt servicing capacity than they do in debt. Now, housing for the elderly, housing for the poor makes sense, but it only makes sense 20 or 30 years from now. That's when it starts becoming productive. What we need in China are investments that become productive immediately because we've got this debt problem.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you.